Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. In exactly 1 week, Donald Trump will be sworn in as America's 47th president. He's promised that one of the first things he'll do is a flurry of executive orders, directives that manage operations of the federal government but have the force of law. Now, last time around, Trump issued EOs at a leisurely pace, signing a single executive order on day one on Obamacare, then in his first week adding a task force on drug trafficking, crime by illegals, and freeing up some land for oil. He added a couple dozen more in his first 100 days, the most significant being the so-called Muslim ban stopping terrorist entry, and initiating the border wall. The Biden regime, in contrast, went to war on day one, issuing 17 orders on his first day alone. Biden's day one orders included a mask mandate, social distancing mandate, and eviction moratoria, rejoining the climate change accords, revoking Trump's deregulation executive orders, and ending construction of the wall. Biden then piled on a dozen DEI orders, redefining gender to include transgenders, requiring the military to admit transgenders, requiring DEI across the federal government, sheltering DACA, and reducing scrutiny of migrants. Now, Trump 2.0 will be different because he now realizes this is war. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump blows past Biden's count, potentially signing up to 50 executive orders in his first week. So what's coming? Probably one of his first will be pardoning J6 protesters, along with Silk Road pioneer Ross Ulbricht, which he has promised Bitcoiners, followed by moves on Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, so an EO to formally establish it, possibly EOs to cut federal waste, promote regulatory reform, promote transparency in accounting, and dare we dream EOs on federal layoffs. That could start with Schedule F, which subjects tens of thousands of policy-related government workers to being fired if they're not doing their job, which very few are. Next is the big policy areas: immigration, energy, military, and DEI. On immigration, top EOs include mass deportations, probably starting with criminals, rebuilding the wall, and the so-called Remain in Mexico program, where migrants have to wait in Mexico while their asylum is being processed. It's even possible we could see something on birthright citizenship, the policy where pregnant migrants sneak in and, as if by magic, become mothers of American citizens. Next is energy, drill baby drill. So Trump has promised to roll back restrictions on drilling, on gasoline vehicles and power plants, and re-exit the Paris Climate Change Accords. Next is military, where Trump's demanded the resignation of all generals involved in DEI and in the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal, along with the reinstatement of any member forced out over the COVID jabs. Finally, social policy, where Trump's promised to ban biological men from women's sports, and to abolish DEI across the federal government, even to investigate George Soros DAs who have been turning American cities into hellscapes. So what's next? Trump has made a lot of promises during the campaign, from no tax on tips to a Bitcoin reserve. A lot of these will take time or require Congress, but many Trump can get started on day one. After what they've put Trump through, really what they've put all of us through, expect Trump to come out guns blazing. California Democrats are once again trying to burn down their entire state, whether by sheer incompetence or perhaps because there's good money in it. The LA wildfires are now projected to be the third most costly natural disaster in American history at $150 billion. For perspective, that's nearly three-quarters the cost of Hurricane Katrina, our worst. In fact, it's one-third the cost of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Now, what's amazing is that unlike a Cat 5 hurricane making a direct hit on New Orleans or a Godzilla tsunami, the LA wildfires should have been nothing. The biggest, the Pacific Palisades fire, apparently either started as a power line spark or in a backyard. Either way, given its mere minutes from the second biggest city in the nation, it should have been out in 20 minutes if LA had funded the fire department, cleared forest brush, and put water in the fire hydrants. Put differently, it was not a natural disaster, it was a government disaster. Now, legacy media, of course, rolled out the global warming laugh track, but thanks to Elon's X, we've seen the curtain pulled back on an almost unbelievable clown show of government incompetence. So the fire hoses were empty, the reservoirs were empty, The fire department budget had been stripped to pay illegals by both LA, $49 million, and the state, $100 million. The unstaffed trucks and equipment were then shipped to Ukraine. So they're gone. LA's water chief, who makes $750,000 a year, was doing the woke circuit how equity is her top priority, not, say, reinstating the 113 experienced LA firefighters fired for being unvaxxed. Victor Davis Hanson summed it up as a, quote, DEI Green New Deal hydrogen bomb, blended with a, quote, systems failure of local government. Now, interestingly, Donald Trump predicted all of this 3 months ago on Joe Rogan, saying California needs to clear out dead brush and fill the reservoirs instead of dumping billions of gallons into the ocean for the environment. LA actually admitted the nearest reservoir to the Pacific Palisades fire was temporarily empty, but thanks to Google Maps, we can see the Santa Ynez Reservoir had actually been completely empty almost continuously since 2009. So there was plenty of water, they just dumped it. Global warming, it works in mysterious ways. So what's next? In a previous video on crumbling infrastructure, I noted how the more cities and states spend, the worse essential services get. Perhaps because the extra money goes to political activists who are very good at wresting additional budget from the guys who fix potholes or maintain water infrastructure. The end result is that the more government spends, the worse it does at the basics. The solution is, of course, easy: slash the budget. Reduce city government to those essentials, so police, fire, sanitation, civic infrastructure like roads, bridges, and yes, water systems. Step 2 is radical transparency. So everything governments do should be wide open to voters, and open to critics like me, who can fill the watchdog role legacy media has singularly failed at. If there's any silver lining to the LA tragedy, it's the importance of focused government and the importance of open government. Democracy does indeed die in darkness, and when they're not being watched, local governments are just as corrupt and just as incompetent as the federal government. Until that's fixed, many more will die. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. It's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. And the IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes, and with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/IRA. You've heard me talk about the need to protect yourself from inflation and central bank currency debasement. Instead of parking your wealth and eroding dollars, there's an alternative: saving and earning interest every month in gold and silver with monetary metals. Gold and silver owners can earn between 2 and 4% on metal leases paid in more ounces of gold and silver. Accredited investors can earn up to 19% in monetary metals precious metal bond offerings. That's real, tangible wealth earning interest every month. This is more than just preserving your wealth. This is growing it in gold and silver that cannot be devalued by the Fed. Visit monetarymetals.com/Peter to learn how to put your gold and silver to work today. Now back to our show. Joe Biden's handlers are looting the Treasury on the way out. Now, granted, it's very normal for deposed dictators to fly out pallets of cash as they scamper off to Moscow or Dubai or Delaware. In Joe's case, he's in line to push $2 trillion out the door before Trump takes office on January 20th, 800 of which will be deficit. Now, $2 trillion is over 30% of the annual budget, meaning Trump will have to trim spending for the rest of the year just to break even. Now, lower spending mechanically subtracts from reported GDP, which makes Trump look bad. In fact, it could knock almost 2% off GDP growth. Beyond looting the republic to sabotage Trump is what Joe is dumping the money into. You guessed it, donors. Since the election just 8 weeks ago, Biden's announced 4 aid packages for Ukraine, with a 5th in the work. That's for a war that's about to end, indeed, which was a lost cause from the start, but has been fantastically profitable for military contractors who own both parties. Of course, the war is just the start. During Biden's occupation of the White House, he's dumped nearly $8 trillion in subsidies to so-called green energy and semiconductors, many in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which was the rebranded Build Back Better Act, which was supposed to be the Great Reset, but as always turned out to be a bag of donor handouts. Now, before the election, Biden's handlers had been doling out the money bit by bit, but once Trump won, they are pretty much dumping it. Just weeks, the administration has dumped nearly $50 billion to 28 climate and chips companies, along with so-called environmental and climate justice grants to 105 community organizers in so-called disadvantaged communities, meaning communities who vote Democrat. Now, one thing Democrats are good at is paying their people with your money. As Zero Hedge puts it, since the election, quote, we are witnessing a COVID-era spending spree without a pandemic. There's one reason bond yields are surging since the election, which had been worrying financial markets. So bond yields are the interest rate on government debt, and they normally go up when the Fed hikes rates. But when they go up on their own, like now, usually means there's some distress in markets, some reason that investors are worried. That could be general fears of a crash, it could be fears about government insolvency, or it could be because they're dumping out so much spending financed with short-term government debt that markets are having trouble digesting it. Now, in a recent video, I mentioned the $10 trillion wall of debt they're handing Trump, $10 trillion that will have to be financed in the next year thanks to Janet Yellen goosing the economy in time for the election. They're now facing that, thanks to Joe Biden, with an empty pantry. So what's next? Biden's crew is doing everything they can to make it hard for Trump to enact the tax cuts, spending cuts, and reforms he and Elon have promised. Mainstream media will do Trump no favors. They'll pretend it's all him. The rest of us have to set the record straight. Credit card defaults are soaring, hitting the highest level since the 2008 crisis. The latest parting gift from Joe Biden's merry band of arsonists. The data comes from BankReg Data, who reports credit card lenders wrote off $46 billion in, quote, seriously delinquent loan balances in the first 9 months of 2024. Seriously delinquent as in zero chance of recovering. Now, note the industry is famous for pretending that bad loans are still alive because it makes them worth more in resale. So the true number is probably much higher. Now, $46 billion is up 50% on the year. It's the highest since the worst of the 2008 crisis. In fact, it's almost 3 times what it was pre-pandemic, as in even after trillions of stimmy checks. As always, high-income households are doing just fine. It's the bottom third of Americans who are tapped out. There's actually been a theme under Joe Biden's stagflation. So economists call it a K-shaped economy, where the rich get richer and the poor get inflation. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Over $6 trillion was printed up during the pandemic to supposedly float the economy through the entire ordeal. In theory, the economy would then come roaring back better than ever. In reality, of course, activists and donors feasted on the extra money, converting it into a bloated, permanent government that is progressively replacing the real economy with welfare and crony spending. From so-called green energy to ammo for Ukraine to an activist industrial complex ranging from university DEI to BLM riots. So what's next? Even with the $46 billion in write-offs, credit card debt is now past $1 trillion, also up almost 50% in the past 2 years. Worse, the interest rate on credit cards just hit a record high of 23%, which is up from 14% pre-pandemic. At 23%, those cards cost $230 billion a year to service. So that's almost double what families were losing pre-pandemic. What made the rates, of course, was the Fed's runaway inflation, which it could have ended by reining in federal spending, but instead hiked rates to strangle private business, essentially using interest rates as a bulldozer to clear the highway of private spending so the Feds could go on driving fast and writing big checks. The jobs and wages drove people to first drain their savings, then to put even necessities on the card. I recently mentioned how an increasing number of Americans are buying groceries on their credit card. And then the rate hikes finished them off, driving rates up on everything from car loans to mortgages to, yes, the credit cards themselves. Put it together and you've got millions of Americans who can't find decent work that pays, but they still have to find a spare $230 billion to service the card. Now, you could argue those loans should not have been made, and maybe in a world without bank bailouts, they wouldn't have been made. Banks would have been more careful. But here they are, and the only way out, short of mass credit card default, is to get the economy back to growing, to get wages above survival level. Mass deportation will help, deregulation and tax cuts will help, and DOGE-led cuts in federal spending will help, but all of that takes time, and Congress will do all they can to stop it, so for now, expect more pain. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and want to get customers excited about your loyalty and rewards program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and reward program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies in the Oshi marketplace at Oshi, that's OSHI.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. Now back to our show. Left-wing media is doing everything they can to talk Americans into a recession. With Donald Trump set to return in less than a week, legacy media is falling over itself to predict economic disaster. U.S. News asks, quote, will Trump's policy spark a recession? Newsweek adds, will there be a recession? The Boston Globe says, quote, Trump's plans promise another great recession. The signal went out from the mothership. Of course, they've been at this since Trump won. Just 4 days after the November election, the Associated Press ran an article called, quote, frustrated Americans await the economic changes they voted for with Trump. That was 4 days after the election, 2 months before he took office. What makes the whole exercise hilarious is that actual recession odds plunged as soon as Trump won. Betting site Kalshi's odds of a recession by the end of 2025 went from 53% the day before the election to just 24%. Now, given Trump was 50-50 before the election on the betting markets, that implies the odds of a recession if Kamala had won were something like 80%. But yeah, blame it on Trump. Now, 24% odds is still pretty bad. In recent videos, I've talked about the mess Biden is leaving Trump, the $2 trillion deficit, the nearly $7 trillion in spending, shrinking jobs for native-born Americans, wages that have spent years underwater, failing to keep up with inflation, and all of the debt buildup that entails. The challenge for Trump is getting his pro-growth policies, so the tax cuts, spending cuts, regulatory cuts, and drill, baby, drill, getting those in place fast enough to take the wind out of the sails of Biden's recession. This was always going to be tricky, especially the spending cuts, which reduce GDP in the short term, but grow the economy tenfold in the long run. Still, Trump has been here before. In 2016, when he was first elected, the economy was also circling the drain towards recession as the anemic Obama recovery from 2008 was running out of steam. Trump turned that into the greatest economy since Ronald Reagan. Of course, a lot has changed since 2016. We've nearly doubled the national debt, so it went from $20 trillion to $36 trillion in just 8 years. And we've tripled debt interest, which is now over $1 trillion a year in interest alone. Meanwhile, all that money drove a near doubling of the federal government, so there's a lot more mouths to feed. It went from $3.9 trillion in spending in 2016 to nearly $7 trillion today, as COVID spending soared, and like all crises, the spending stuck around long after the alleged crisis was over. So what's next? The solution here is easy, at least on paper. So repeat Trump 1.0 on taxes. He's already floated cuts to small business tax, no tax on overtime, tips, Social Security. In fact, he's questioned the entire income tax. Number 2 is go even harder on regulations. So last time Trump canceled 8 regulations for every new one, but between DOGE and recent deregulatory Supreme Court decisions, he could 10x that this time. And 3, the big one, slash the federal government. So I'm old enough to remember 2016, and it didn't seem like a government at $3.9 trillion was any worse than today's at $7 trillion. We still had firemen, we had Social Security, we had national parks. Now, Elon has floated $2 trillion in cuts. Maybe we should go ahead and make it 3. In the meantime, you can bet the media's favorite word in 2025 will be recession, as they desperately try to sabotage every Trump effort to fix the half-broken economy that Biden has given him. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.